Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, and I'm a board member of Bay Area Skeptics. Welcome to the May 2025 Skep Talk. Now, last week at this time, I was getting ready to go to a conference in Calgary where the organizers had asked me to talk about the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. That was the one about the legality of teaching intelligent design. Some of you or most of you are probably familiar with that. Now, Canadians have a higher rate of acceptance of evolution than the United States, and their creationism movement isn't as large or as well organized as ours. So I really wanted to include something that would make the trial more relevant to Canadians. So I chose to talk, in addition to the trial and some of the other background information, about the importance of understanding how it is that the intelligent design proponents frame their arguments, because just refuting their science isn't sufficient to persuade the public that the views do not belong in the science classroom. The amount of public support ID received and does receive reflects how they appeal to ideologies and values shared by their fellow Americans, all of us. And unfortunately for skeptics and those people who think like us, intelligent design does not stand or fall on the quality of its science. So it's quite a coincidence that our speaker tonight will be dealing with some of the same ideas. But he's looking at the intelligent design controversy through a political scientist lens, whereas I was looking at it through the standpoint of, I guess you'd call me an activist at the time, somebody who was part of the legal team. Thomas Nelson has a PhD in social psychology and heads the political psychology PhD program in the political science department at Ohio State University. His research looks at how psychological theories help us understand politics and how understanding politics helps to expand psychological theory. His recent book, published just last fall, Political Persuasion, The Use of Values in Communication, explores how advocates of different positions in two public controversies, one of which is the teaching of intelligent design, appeal to public values in their efforts to get public support. As he says in his book, values are like highly talented people. It's always good to have them working for you rather than the competition. And of course, it isn't just intelligent design partisans who try to recruit support through recruiting values. Partisans of other controversies, you know them, vaccinations, GMOs, fluoridation, abortion, many other, similarly recruit and find support among the public by appealing to culturally shared values. These are techniques that appeal across a wide range of controversial issues, not just creationism and evolution and Kitzmiller. Please welcome Dr. Tom Nelson, whose title tonight is How Intelligent Design Nearly Won. Welcome to Bay Area Skeptics, Tom.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm not sure if there's anything left for me to say. I think you covered it all.
Heavens no, that was just the hors d'oeuvres.
Okay, very good.
But I did find it rather amusing that, you were scheduled in May, and I had, been scheduled for this cavalry, sorry, that place up in Canada, this conference months ago, and I realized, holy smokes, we're really in kind of parallel chains here. But you're looking at it from the standpoint of a political scientist, which
Right.
is a rather different approach. One of the things that I've been trying to do with the Bay Area Skeptics Talks is not only deal with natural sciences, but also bring in social sciences.
Right.
And so I'm very delighted to have your perspective on this.
Right.
I'm sure you and I will have a chance to chat a little bit later on, but let's let everybody who is watching us hear you. And so please, Tom, take it away.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you so much. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so yes, the title of my talk is How Intelligent Design Nearly Won. And I'm really thrilled to be here for two reasons. One is that, to be honest, I spend most of my professional life talking to people like me, other social scientists, other academics. And so I'm really thrilled to get the opportunity to present these ideas for the first time, really, to what we call normal people in the academy, people like you. So I'm really happy to present this and hear what you all have to say about it and what you have to think about it. The other reason I'm thrilled is because, to be honest, I think I owe Jeannie a lot, sort of a debt of honor. And the folks at the National Center for Science Education, who are really extremely helpful in helping me do the background work and the research for my book. Jeannie is kind of helpful in two ways. One, of course, she and the organization have just so much information about not just the ID movement, but lots of different kinds of challenges and threats to science education. But as Jeannie herself said, she's an activist. So she was actually a subject of my study, because the study really is about how activists frame their arguments in an effort to persuade ordinary folks like us, as well as political leaders, policymakers, and so on. So this is the book coming up. Sorry. There it is. Okay. So yeah, this is the book that my research culminated again. It was published last fall by Oxford University Press. And of course, I'd be delighted if you all went on Amazon and purchased it, but I will warn you, it's a bit pricey. I had nothing to do with setting the price. So if you want to wait for the paperback, I can't really blame you. Anyway, one thing I want to point out is that this is a book in a series on political psychology. So that's what I do. I do political psychology. I am not a biologist, okay? So I'm not here to kind of rehash all the arguments about why intelligent design is wrong-headed and fraudulent, and that's not my job. There are people who are much better than me at doing that kind of thing. I really want to talk about it in terms of the politics of communication and how political communication works in a democratic system. Okay. So what I want to do is to talk about some of my ideas about the role of persuasive speech in a democratic system and why I think the focus on values is really critical to this. Second thing I want to do is, of course, talk about the ID case as a case study in political communication and persuasive speech. I'm going to talk about my little idea about value recruitment, which was actually the original title for my book, but the publisher didn't like it. I'll provide some examples from the ID debate of the kinds of persuasive speech that I think were quite important. Okay, I'll present a little bit of my research findings, nothing too technical, results of some experiments that I ran. And then I'll wrap up by kind of expanding our perspective about anti-science speech beyond the intelligent design case. Okay. Okay, so I'm a political scientist, so let's start with a little political science. Okay. So back in 1960, a political scientist named Elber Erich Schachtschneider, who we now just refer to as E.E. Schachtschneider, published a thin little book, only 140 pages, much shorter than my book, and it's called The Semi-Sovereign People, A Realist's View of Democracy in America. And what Schachtschneider was trying to argue is that our idea of democracy as kind of a large sort of New England town hall meeting is really unrealistic, okay? Schattenschneider was writing at a time when the science of public opinion research and polling was really kind of coming into its own as a legitimate scientific and academic exercise. And a lot of the research was showing that citizens don't always live up to our expectations about what we would hope a citizen would be in a democratic system. A lot of citizens were very disengaged from politics, weren't terribly well informed about political issues. And so they weren't really acting like the sort of philosopher citizens that we sort of expected them to be. But Schattenschneider was also reacting against the idea that citizens were not capable of governing themselves. He said, yeah, democracy can work, but we really have to understand in a realistic way how it really happens. And so this is a quote from the very beginning of the book. He says, to understand any conflict, it is necessary, therefore, to keep constantly in mind the relations between the combatants and the audience, because the audience is likely to do the kinds of things that determine the outcome of the fight. This is the basic pattern of all politics. So I've always really liked this idea that the audience determines the victor of the fight. The audience is us, the citizens, okay? And the combatants are the leaders, the organizations, the political entrepreneurs who are trying to gain power, trying to change policy. They can't do it without our support, okay? Or to put it a little bit more succinctly, Richard Perloff said, politics has always been about persuasion, for better and sometimes for worse, okay? So the idea from Schattenschneider and Perloff and others is that public opinion is a political asset. It's something that allows the political actor or entrepreneur to get things done, okay? Now, how do we know this? Well, let's go back to 2001. And there was a controversy at the time over embryonic stem cell research. Now, if you don't know about this issue, it was a controversy because embryonic stem cells are very useful in medical research as well as medical practice, but in order to get them, you have to destroy the developing fetus, usually a fetus of about 5 to 7 days old, okay? And so for a lot of people, that sounds an awful lot like abortion. Okay, so that was the reason for the controversy. So the Gallup organization did a poll, did a survey in July 2001, and they asked people this question. As you may know, the federal government is considering whether to fund certain kinds of medical research known as stem cell research. Do you think the federal government should or should not fund this type of research, or don't you know enough to say? So I'd consider this a pretty objective, pretty straightforward survey question. I teach survey research design methods, and this just seems like a very straightforward version of a question. The striking thing is, as you can see, a lot of people didn't express an opinion about this, right? The majority said they just didn't know enough to have an opinion about this issue. Okay, so fine, all well and good, but it turns out that about a month before the Gallup organization's poll, there was a second survey that was sponsored by the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, okay? And they asked about stem cell attitudes as well, but in a very different way. Their question went like this: stem cells are the basic cells from which all of a person's tissues and organs develop. Congress is considering whether to provide federal funding for experiments using stem cells from human embryos. The live embryos would be destroyed in their first week of development to obtain the cells. Do you support or oppose using your federal tax dollars for such experiments? Okay. Look at the results. They're completely different from the results of the Gallup organization's poll. So whereas in the Gallup organization poll, the supporters of stem cell research outnumbered the opponents by roughly 2.5 to 1, right? Even though the majority, as I said before, said that they just didn't know enough to express an opinion. Look at the results of the Catholic Bishops survey, okay? 70% are opposed to stem cell research, and now we only have about 5-6% who say they don't know enough to express an opinion, and the supporters were far outnumbered by the opponents. Okay, what's going on here? Well, I argue that this is an example of an organization, the Catholic Bishops, who are using public opinion as a kind of political asset, right? They've designed a survey to produce results that appear to match their position on the issues. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that the bishops are underhanded about this or they're up to no good here. A lot of organizations produce surveys of this sort, and the goal is not just to measure public opinion, but to provide the appearance of public support for your position. So that's what I'm talking about. When I say public opinion is a political asset, that's the sort of thing I mean. Okay, so my argument is that that values are a kind of a sort of persuasive tool. Okay, something that we use in order to try to persuade other people to adopt our point of view. Okay. Now, I want to sort of try to illustrate this by comparing it to another common political persuasive tactic, which is appealing to our material interests. Okay. So if I were, say, a political candidate running for office, I might say something to you like, well, if you elect me, I'll lower your taxes, or I'll provide some other kind of material benefit to you. Okay? And a lot of politics is like this, right? A lot of politics is people with competing material interests and trying to persuade people by showing them how, if you adopt my position, it's going to be beneficial to you. Okay, well, that's not all there is to politics. There are a lot of issues that don't really involve material benefits in one way or another, right? So let's take the ultimate hot button issue, namely abortion politics. Okay, so in abortion politics, of course, abortion policy has tremendous impact on many people's lives. But if you think about the activists who are most involved in the abortion debate, most of them are not going to be affected one way or the other, depending on whether abortion is legal or not. Okay? And yet they are passionately involved in the debate, even though it's not going to have any impact on their own lives. Okay? So why is that? Well, I think it's because abortion, like many of these what we call symbolic issues, connects to the principles and the values that we hold dear. Okay? They're the kinds of beliefs that we have that shape our social behavior, shape our political outlooks, right? And we call these things values. Values it's a word that's in a lot of common everyday speech. Everybody has kind of a good idea of what a value is. I'll provide a sort of a political sciencey, social sciencey definition. I think of values as ideals or goals or desires that we consider to be good. Okay, and let me show you some examples. Right, so in the world of political science, we talk about political values like freedom, democracy, and so on. These are all things that we admire. These are ideals that we try to uphold and live up to. They're consensus values because everybody agrees that these are good things, right? Try to find me somebody who thinks that freedom is a bad thing, right? You're not going to be able to do it, at least not in the American democratic system, right? Social psychologists tend to look at social values, fairness, compassion, so forth. There are even individual values, things like achievement and self-expression, okay? So these are the kinds of values that researchers have looked at a lot in relation to people's political views, their political attitudes, their social behavior, and so forth. In the intelligent design debate, I believe that there's another set of values that don't get as much attention from the social scientists, but I think we're critical. I'm calling these enlightenment values. So they include things like knowledge, wisdom, education, science. Okay? I think these are really critical to the intelligent design debate and its kind of its outcome. Right? Okay, so the idea behind what I call value recruitment is my goal as a persuader, my goal as a communicator is to try to prove to you that my position helps to uphold, promote, and advance the values that you care about. And if you care about those values, and I can convince you that I'm the best representative of those values, you should come on board and support me. That's the essence of value recruitment. Okay, so let's talk about how this works in the intelligent design debate. Okay, now the heyday of intelligent design was roughly between the early 1990s, roughly up to it about just before 2010. Okay, so that kind of 15 to 18 year period. I know it's a while ago, and some of you might not be very familiar with the debate. So let me just do a quick review so we're all kind of on the same page. Okay, so sorry, I lost my cursor. There it goes. Okay, so so to summarize the evolution position, and I'm probably telling you folks things that you already know, but the basic idea behind evolution is that there's variation across organisms. A lot of that variation is based in our genotypes, right? So I have a genotype that produced a gap between my two front teeth, okay? So we all have different genotypes, right? They find expression in our phenotypes, in our behavior, what we look like, how we act, and so on, okay? And this varies from one individual to the next. And natural selection favors reproductively viable organisms, right? So if I have a particular genotype that produces a trait in me or a behavior in me that makes me more successful in surviving to my reproductive years and reproducing myself, then that genotype will be favored in future generations, okay? Really simple, right? Okay. Now, the important key point about evolutionary theory is it's really silent on the origins of life. Okay, Charles Darwin was not about trying to explain, where life came from. He just wanted to talk about how it changed and evolved over time. Okay, and this is important to remember because a lot of the attacks that we hear from creationists, intelligent design advocates, and so forth on evolutionary theory really focus on this fact that evolutionary theory can't explain where organic molecules came from. You're right, it can't, but it wasn't supposed to in the first place. All right, so the intelligent design position. Okay, so when Charles Darwin published his book, Origin of Species, in 1859, excuse me, it was immediately seen by some people as an attack on religion, an attack on religious faith. And this is particularly the case for people who had a literalist interpretation of the Bible, especially the book of Genesis, right? Who really thought the book of Genesis was the actual word of God and described in accurate detail how the universe was created and how life on earth came to be. Okay, so these are the people who perceived a threat from evolutionary theory, and this group, we'll just call them creationists. Okay, so in the early years, we saw this debate back and forth between evolution and creationism. Okay, so intelligent design came along in the early 1990s. Okay, and it kind of represented a new direction for this age-old debate. Okay, so what intelligent design advocates believe is that biological features are simply too complex to have evolved in the, quote, random fashion, close quote, that evolutionary theory seemed to present. Okay, so since they couldn't have evolved that way, they must have been deliberately designed by some intelligent agent. Okay, now notice the word creation never appears in any of this language. Okay? And that was a deliberate choice by the intelligent design advocates. They really wanted to sever any connection between themselves and creationism, creation science. These were all problematic concepts, and they wanted to just do away with that. Okay? So they were very explicit that the designer, whoever it was, whatever it was, is unknown and perhaps never knowable. Okay? We don't need to know who the designer is in order to infer that there must have been a designer, because evolution simply could not have produced the complex sort of interdependent mechanisms of life that we've observed. Okay. Now, this may seem like a newfangled idea, but in my view, it's really quite an old idea. So long before Origin of Species was published, there was another book by a British theologian, William Paley, came out in 1802, and it was called Natural Theology. Okay, so there he is. There's our hero, William Paley. William Paley used the analogy of a watch to explain how the natural world provides evidence of God's existence. So Paley argued, well, imagine you're walking along a path and you sort of happen upon a watch that's been left by the side of the path. You pick it up. You don't know where the watch came from. You certainly didn't see anybody make the watch, but you have to infer, based on the complexity of the watch, the intricate, interconnected parts, that it must have been built by some deliberate action, by some agent or another, in this case, obviously a human watchmaker. Okay, so Paley says, we can look at nature and how complex and wonderfully interconnected nature is, and we can infer the same thing, that somebody must have deliberately planned and created nature. It couldn't have just happened by accident. Okay, so in that way, I sort of think of the ID argument as a kind of a recycling or updating of Paley's natural theology argument, his watchmaker analogy. All right, just a few kind of highlights from the history of the ID movement, or the history of the ID debate. Of course, way back when Darwin published The Origin of Species, the first real legal battle involving creation and evolution was in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, the so-called Scopes monkey trial. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Okay, so that was the first time there was a kind of a legal challenge pitting evolution and creationism against each other. So periodically, additional challenges would come up. States, municipalities would pass laws that would mandate the teaching of creationism. Okay, ultimately, they were all shot down by the courts as being unconstitutional. Okay? The most recent one was 1987, Edwards versus Aguilar. This one made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what the court found in a 7-2 majority ruling was that the Louisiana statute that mandated that creationism be taught alongside evolutionary theory in school was unconstitutional. It violated the First Amendment. Okay? So then in the 1990s, we start to see the development of this alternative idea, kind of derived from creationism, but deliberately sort of separate from creationism, and that is intelligent design. Okay? And then shortly after that, states, municipalities started to mandate instruction in intelligent design in public high school science classes. Okay, so this happened in Kansas, happened in my home state of Ohio. Okay, and it happened in a tiny little community in Western Pennsylvania called Dover. Okay, so the Dover School Board, they kind of went back and forth about how exactly to implement this, but they ended up requiring that the high school biology textbook have a disclaimer in it saying that, evolution is just a theory. And if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in learning about alternative ideas, here are some resources for you. Okay. So some parents in the school district got angry. They sued the school district. The ACLU kind of came, represented them pro bono. And in the end, the case was decided in favor of the plaintiffs, in favor of the parents, and the policy was judged in federal district court to be unconstitutional. And we'll go over that decision in a little more detail later on. So shortly after that, then these states and these areas that had mandated the teaching of intelligent design, including Ohio and Kansas, decided to drop it. Okay. And kind of the last gasp for intelligent design was a feature film called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. It's shown in theaters around the country. Really interesting piece of kind of anti-science propaganda. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's on YouTube. It's really interesting as an example of the sort of rhetorical communication tactics that I'll be talking about. Okay, so there's a little background on the intelligent design issue. Okay, so why is it advantageous to try to recruit values? What does it do for you? Okay, well, if we look back at creationism, creation science, all those things that preceded intelligent design, the way that they tried to generate political support was to appeal to like-minded people, namely Christian conservatives, okay? People who were suspicious and skeptical about evolution and really believed in the Bible creation story. Now, there are a lot of those people out there, okay? So creationism enjoyed a lot of public support for many years, but it's an inherently divisive strategy, right? Because not everybody is a creationist. And even people who are, kind of sympathetic to creationist views, maybe they're conservative Christians themselves, are a little bit skeptical about the creationist movement, okay? So that kind of strategy inherently cuts off potential supporters. what intelligent design did by separating itself from creationism was to that enabled them to appeal to consensus values like fairness. Okay, so they're able to cast a wider net and attract more supporters. Okay, in effect, what intelligent design is telling us is even if you're skeptical about our theory, okay, even if you're not completely sold on intelligent design, you certainly believe in fairness. Okay, and so if I can convince you that it's only fair that we teach intelligent design in the classrooms, it doesn't matter if you don't believe in intelligent design, you should still support our efforts to try to get it included in high school science classes. Okay. So what I did in my research is I interviewed people like Jeannie on the anti-ID side. I interviewed people, activists on the pro-ID side. I interviewed Philip Johnson and Michael Behe, all of the sort of intellectual leaders of the ID movement, both nationally and in my home state of Ohio, okay, as well as people who are opposed to them, to try to understand their communication strategies. Okay? And I kind of break it down this way. I break it down into the values that they made reference to, and these included, and as well as the recruitment tactics that they used, the communication strategies they used to try to recruit the values. So these values included familiar ideas, freedom, fairness, science, education, even religion. And we can talk more about that later on. This was a tough act for the ID side, but they did try to recruit religious values as well. Okay. As far as the tactics are concerned, so values are familiar ideas. We all know what these words mean. The tactics, less familiar. Okay, so let me just kind of walk through a couple of these. Right. One important recruitment tactic was framing. Now, in framing, what you do is try to present a certain representation of the issue or concepts involved in the issue that kind of pushes people towards a certain kind of interpretation of what's going on. So in the ID debate, some people, the anti-ID activists tried to frame the intelligent design movement as just warmed over creationism. They tried to say, you know, guys, this is the same old creationist stuff that we've been hearing for decades. ID activists, on the other hand, tried to frame the resistance to the intelligent design movement as an example of dogmatic Darwinism. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. Okay. Plenty of people used analogies to make these connections. Okay. So in an analogy, you take something that's familiar and you use it to try to interpret and understand something that's unfamiliar. Right? Then there are a variety of tactics that I call value qualification. One of the most important was something called institutional role assignment. Okay. Now, to understand institutional role assignment, it's helpful to use another example. This would be things like school newspapers. Okay? A lot of schools have newspapers, high schools have high school newspapers, and so forth. Okay. Sometimes these high school newspapers print things that that the school administration doesn't like. And so they will censor the newspaper, okay? And the students who are in charge of the newspaper get angry, right? And they bring it to court, right? And time again, the courts have ruled that school districts, schools have the right to censor school newspapers, even though we have a First Amendment that guarantees freedom of the press, right? And the reason is because the schools have a special role, and their role is to educate young people. Okay? And that role is so important that it even overrides freedom of the press. Okay? So it is appropriate in certain cases for schools to censor school newspapers. So that's what I'm talking about with institutional role assignment. The schools have a special role, okay, and they can't allow things to interfere with that role. Okay. And then a final tactic is called social cueing, and that includes things like extremism, where you try to cast doubt on your opponents by showing that they're really out of touch with ordinary values, with ordinary concerns. Again, I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. Okay, so what about this idea about framing? Okay, now here I'm going to show you a little bit of my research. So what is this issue of ID all about? What's the controversy all about? Well, there's different ways of framing what the controversy is all about. The most straightforward way to frame it is simply to ask the question, should students learn intelligent design in their high school biology class, right? Very straightforward, okay? But there are other ways of depicting the issue. And from people on the intelligent design side, they really favored alternative framings for the issue. For instance, this one. Students would learn best if they heard all sides of the controversy over evolution before making up their own minds of the issue. Okay, that was a popular one. And another popular one from the ID perspective was this one: students should learn all the evidence for and against Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. Okay, notice the latter two frames don't mention intelligent design at all, okay? But they put the issue in terms of these very popular values like fairness, education, critical thinking, and so forth. So do these frames make a difference? Well, I conducted a survey in which I asked people to express how much they agreed or disagreed with all three of these statements. Okay, so every person saw all three statements and they expressed their agreement or disagreement with each of these statements. And this is what we found. Okay, so what we've got here is a graph, and the blue bars represent how much the person agreed with each of these three statements. Okay, and as you can see, agreement with the sort of straightforward intelligent design version or frame, okay, was kind of moderate, right? It's about a 3 on a 5-point scale, okay? But agreement was much stronger with the latter two framings, the framings of the issue that made reference to these consensus values like fairness, critical thinking, education, and so forth. So framing really does seem to make a difference, okay? And ID people were very clever in kind of concocting these frames to put the issue in the most favorable light for them. Okay. I mentioned analogies, a critical, very important tactic for people on both sides of the ID debate. What I want to do now is just to show you the very beginning of that film, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, which is a kind of a pro-ID propaganda film, came out in 2007. Okay, so I want you, this is a little quiz, I want you to try to spot the analogy that's being used here. All right. So did you get it? Do you get the analogy? Okay. Obviously, it's the Berlin Wall, right? Okay, so that's old footage that they've interspersed with the credits showing the construction of the Berlin Wall following World War II, okay, and the sort of Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, okay? So this analogy supports the general frame, the dogmatic Darwinism frame, because what the ID people are trying to argue is that the resistance to the teaching of intelligent design is kind of like the East Germans, the communists building the Berlin Wall to keep out dangerous ideas from the West. Okay, pretty effective, right? Okay. So what the ID advocates wanted was for intelligent design to be included in high school biology classes. Okay, they didn't want to replace evolution. Okay, they knew that was not going to go anywhere, but they just wanted inclusion. They wanted inclusion of ID alongside of evolution. So to make that case, to make that argument legitimate, they had to portray intelligent design as a legitimate alternative scientific theory. So it was important for them to recruit that sort of enlightenment value of science. All right. So let me talk about how they tried to do that. So this book came out originally in 1996, Michael J. Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. Okay. Michael Behe is a biochemist at Lehigh University. I interviewed him for this project. Very cordial guy, answered all my questions, right? What this book argues is that, well, of course, Darwin back in the 1850s had no idea like how cells work, you know, he didn't know anything about the intricate sort of machinery inside the cells, but now we do. People like Michael Behe know a lot about how cells operate, right? And so what he wanted to argue was that the mechanisms of the cell are so complex and so interconnected that there's no way they could have evolved just by accident, right? And so he's got lots of text kind of like this in the book, okay? I don't expect you to read all this, right? But I just want you to notice how technical, how complicated, right? How scientific all this language is, right? The book is full of stuff like this, right? I don't think Behe expects his readers to understand any of this, really. He just wants to impress you with the amazing complexity of structures and processes inside cells, right? So looks a lot like science, doesn't it, right? Helps sustain the argument that ID is a legitimate scientific theory. Okay, so I did another experiment, okay? In this experiment, I call it blinding them with science, okay? I'm dating myself here, guys, right? I went to college right after MTV came online. So my friends and I in the dorm wasted a lot of time in front of the TV watching MTV videos, right? And one of them was a song by Thomas Dolby called She Blinded Me with Science, right? So that's why I came up with this name for my experiment. All right, so in the experiment, what I did was I showed people, sorry, I won't get to that in a second. I showed people either that paragraph I just showed you from Behe's book, or I showed them a simple, kind of straightforward, very accessible description of intelligent design theory without all that sort of technical language involved. Okay, so you either got the technical, sort of complicated version or the simple version. That's simple enough, right? But I threw in a little bit of an extra thing in here just because I thought it'd be interesting, right? So I'm a political psychologist. I'm interested in psychology, and I'm interested in human motivation. And there's a motivation called the need for cognition, okay? The need for cognition simply describes individual differences in how much people like to think, how much they enjoy thinking, how much they get pleasure out of solving problems, understanding the world better, right? Okay, so this is an individual difference. Some people are strong in the need for cognition. Like all of you online right now, I'm sure, are very strong in need for cognition. Some people are less strong in need for cognition, okay? And so need for cognition is measured through a simple questionnaire. It includes questions like this, right? Okay, so what I did was I used this measure to divide my sample up into two groups, those with strong need for cognition and those with weak need for cognition. And then I examined the effect of these two different texts, the complicated text and the simple text, for people who are high and low in need for cognition, okay? And this is what the results look like. Okay, so let me walk you through here. There's really two notable findings here. First of all, ignore the colors just for a second. Just kind of think about the average of these two columns. It's around 3.4, 3.5, right? And the average of these two columns, which is about 2.65, 2.7, something like that. So clearly people with low need for cognition, just right out of the box, are more accepting of intelligent design than people who are high in need for cognition. Okay, that I think is interesting in and of itself. So now look at the colors, right? The orange bar is the people who got the simple message, the simple description of intelligent design. And you can see, there's some support for intelligent design in this group, but that support shoots up among the people who got the complicated, very technical description of intelligent design, okay? But the remarkable thing is that difference was only observed among people who were low in need for cognition. Among people who are high in need for cognition, the type of message they got didn't matter, okay? Now, why is this happening? Well, one explanation is that people who are high in need for cognition are usually very careful in scrutinizing the messages they get. They really think carefully about the content of the message, whether the arguments are strong or weak. So it's possible that these people simply were not very impressed by all that sort of technical language that was in Behe's book. Okay, so recruiting science succeeded especially well for this group of people. Okay. Now, I don't want to go too long, so I think I'm going to skip over some of the other sort of research presentations. I want to talk a little bit about social cueing and extremism. Okay, so let me find that slide. Okay. So going back to the Expelled movie again, I want to talk about how ID advocates use social cues to try to portray evolutionary theory in a very negative light. Okay, so let me play this clip from the movie. Or not. Come on. There it goes.
In part, I think Matthew Arnold put his hands on it when he spoke about the withdrawal of faith. There is a connection between a society that has at least a minimal commitment to certain kinds of transcendental values and what human beings permit themselves to do one to the other.
That got me thinking, what other societies have used Darwinism to trump all other authorities, including religion? As a Jew, my mind leapt to one regime in particular.
The connection between Hitler and Darwin is, of course, historically a difficult connection because they were separated by a good many years. One was English, one was German. Nonetheless, if you open Mein Kampf and read it, especially if you can read it in German, the correspondence between Darwinian ideas and Nazi ideas just leaps from the page. Of course, you have to add every historical caution. Not everyone who read Darwin became a Nazi. Obviously not. No one is making that case. Darwinism is not a sufficient condition for a phenomenon like Nazism, but I think it's certainly a necessary one.
Okay, so again, the idea with the extremism tactic is to cast doubt on the opposing side's recruitment of values, right? So in this case, you might think, if you're observing this debate, you might think, maybe the evolutionists have got the right idea here. Maybe there's really something to this evolutionary theory. What the extremism tactic says is that these people are so out of touch. Look at the extremes to which they will go. Taking these ideas and really running with them. The purpose of this is just to cast doubt on the other side's recruitment of values like science and so forth. Okay, I feel like my time is kind of running out, so I really want to kind of jump ahead now to some concluding thoughts, right? Okay, so I've talked about how ID almost won. The question is, why didn't they win? Okay, if recruiting values is such a great idea from a political persuasion point of view, what went wrong? Okay, well, basically, this is what killed intelligent design, folks. This is a textbook, a pro-ID textbook called Of Pandas and People, and this book, many copies of this book were sent to anonymously to students in the Dover school district, and the students were told, if you're curious about alternatives to evolution, check out this book. Okay, when the Dover case went to trial, during the discovery phase, the ACLUs representing the plaintiffs found some earlier copies, some earlier drafts of this textbook, I think with help from the NCSE. Jeannie can tell you a lot more of the details of how this all came down. But basically what they found was the writers of this textbook had gone through the earlier drafts where it said creationism, 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 and just kind of searched out and replaced all those references to creationism, replaced them with intelligent design. Otherwise, the textbook was exactly the same. So this is kind of the smoking gun that showed that there was this continuum between creationism and intelligent design. Okay, and so the judge presiding, John Jones III, wrote in his opinion, the overwhelming evidence is that intelligent design is a religious view, a mere relabeling of creationism and not a scientific theory. Therefore, it's unconstitutional. Okay, so it's worth probably taking a look at the First Amendment, right? We think about the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution as the one that guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It certainly does that, but the very first phrase in the First Amendment is what we call the Establishment Clause. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Okay, what that means in plain English is there cannot be any official U.S. religion. Okay, so public institutions like the public schools cannot advocate in favor of any particular religious point of view, and that's exactly what creationism is. Okay. So that was really kind of the death blow for intelligent design. And as I showed you earlier, shortly after the Dover decision came down, states like Ohio and Kansas really kind of abandoned their efforts to try to mandate the instruction in intelligent design. Okay, so let me just kind of wrap up at this point, right? So political actors, as I've argued, succeed by recruiting consensus values. They try to connect their position to values and principles that we all agree in, we all agree with, we all share, right? And ID almost won by recruiting these popular values: fairness, freedom, science, education, and so forth, but it ultimately lost because it could not cut the ties to creationism. Okay, now maybe this makes you feel good about the future of science education. Maybe it doesn't make you feel so good. If the ID crowd had not slipped up, okay, and left that smoking gun for the plaintiff's lawyers to discover, who knows what would have happened with intelligent design, okay? So just a few words about the future and trying to make some connections with other kinds of anti-science activity, okay? So intelligent design in so many words may have gone away, okay? But some of the same ideas are still floating around. So for instance, in Arkansas, there's a bill in the House mandating critical analysis of evolution and equal time for creationism, okay? So this is still going on, right? In my own state of Ohio, there's a bill that's going to be signed by our governor almost any day now called HB1 that mandates the balanced treatment of controversial topics in universities. So my home institution, Ohio State University, we now have to present a balanced treatment of controversial topics. Now, nobody knows exactly what that means, okay? But if I talk about intelligent design in my political science classes, maybe that means I have to present a sort of an objective portrayal of intelligent design theory. I'm not sure. I don't know what's going to happen, right? And kind of more broadly beyond the ID issue, right? We see a lot of anti-science action on issues like climate change, vaccines, as Jeannie mentioned earlier on. I want to close with one thing here, okay? So the problem for people like climate skeptics, vaccine skeptics, and so forth, is they face a serious problem, the same problem that the intelligent design advocates faced, which is the scientific consensus is completely against them, right? As I said earlier, almost no legitimate scientist believes in creationism, believes in intelligent design. There are almost no legitimate climate scientists who believe that climate change is not happening. There are hardly any medical researcher who thinks that vaccines are associated with autism or any of those other terrible things. Okay, so this is a real problem for these science critics. How do you confront, how do you deal with the problem that the entire scientific world is against you? Okay, well, I'll show you how they cope with it, right? So Philip Johnson, one of the leaders of the intelligent design movement, I interviewed him in 2007. He wrote a couple of books, one of which is called Darwin on Trial, that really kind of kicked off the intelligent design movement. Okay? And I asked him about this problem, why is it that all the scientists disagree with you? And this is what he had to say. He said, this has all the characteristics of an inquisition. Fortunately, they aren't burning people at the stake. They're merely taking away their research grants or tenure. Okay? Every culture has a creation story, and every culture has a priesthood, which is the body of officials, the authoritative figures who have a license to tell the creation story. That's the priesthood. Okay, that's the dogmatic Darwinism story all over again, that frame all over again, right? Right. So let's fast forward 7 years, okay? And George Will, who's a well-known conservative columnist, was talking about climate science. And again, the problem that climate skepticism has almost no support in the scientific community. And this is what he had to say about that. He said, there's a sociology of science. Scientists are not saints in white laboratory smocks. They have got interests like everybody else. If you want a tenure track position in academia, don't question the reigning orthodoxy on climate science, on climate change. If you want money from the biggest source of direct research in this country, the federal government, don't question its orthodoxy. If you want to get along with your peers, conform to peer pressure. That's what's happening. Okay? So in both cases, what we're seeing is this argument that, well, the scientific community is a very closed-minded, very conformist kind of community. They're not open to alternative ideas. They're not open to, alternative theories, right? You see the same thing over and over again. Vaccine skeptics say the same thing, right? Now, I don't want to end on a kind of a pessimistic note, okay? So even though we're seeing this kind of stuff going on all the time, thank God for organizations like Jeannie's organization, right, that are helping to defend legitimate science instruction out there, okay? And kind of the comforting thing is there really is a scientific consensus, right? There really is a truth out there, and scientific research is pointing us to the truth, okay? The trick is that we have to help people understand legitimate science from illegitimate science, help them to recognize these kinds of tactics that are used to cast doubt on science. Hopefully, my research will shed a little bit of light on that. Okay, well, I really want to thank you all, and thank Jeannie, thank the audience for paying attention for all this time, and I'm delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Tom, very much. Yeah, there's got a couple pages of notes because I was really finding this fun and finding a lot of
I'll
familiar.
send you my slides. How about that?
Yeah, I'd love some. No, we obviously share a lot of ideas and a lot of the analysis of this. Very similar perspectives on this. I think you were absolutely right when you said that I was a subject of your study as well as a source of information generically. Right. And you talked tonight properly, I think, given our audience, about the perspective of the intelligent design movement and what sorts of topics they were, or what values they were focusing on. But do you have any thoughts about our perspective, shall we say, the opponents of intelligent design?
So one thing I didn't have time to get to was, and this is kind of an indirect way of answering your questions. I apologize for that. So the scientific community, people like you, people like, the biologists I talked to in Ohio, at Ohio State and so forth, I feel like they were really kind of put on the defensive by the intelligent design movement and the way they recruited these consensus values. Because what they managed to do is they made people like you look like the bad guys. They made you look like you were against all these wonderful ideas like freedom and fairness and education and critical thinking. All right. Yeah. So that put you in a very awkward position. Right. And you had to kind of say things like, freedom is great, fairness is great, right? But maybe not in the science classroom, right? Maybe outside of the science classroom, of course, but maybe not in the science classroom. The science classroom is not where we give equal time to all ideas, whether they're good or bad ideas, right? So that's a really hard argument to make, okay?
It's nuanced.
What? Sorry?
It's nuanced.
Yeah, it's very nuanced, right? And it's kind of like, I talked about institutional role assignment and how, for instance, schools have the right to censor newspapers. Schools have the right to impose dress codes, right? And it's because it's all part of the educational mission, right? And so it's a very nuanced argument to be able to say, look, fairness, wonderful idea, right? But it really interferes with our mission of teaching science, right? If we were to give equal time to all the sort of cockamamie ideas out there, right, you would just confuse the students, right? It would just, so
the way we handle that particular issue. I mean, first of all, full stop. The fairness argument is the best thing they had. Their science was terrible.
Yeah,
I mean, if you ever actually kind of, you don't even have to understand anything about flagellae or blood clotting systems or any of the other supposedly irreducibly complex structures.
Right.
If you just sort of stand back and you look at the structure of their argument, they're saying that it's essentially, well, you're wrong, so therefore I win.
Yeah, right.
They're saying that complex biological structures like flagella and blood clotting and immune system and these things, they're so complicated, there couldn't possibly be a natural explanation. Therefore, they're designed.
Yep. Yep.
But
Yep.
of course, that's not how you do science.
No.
I mean, probably
Of
the
course.
people who are listening
Yeah.
to this understand why that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is a bad argument from a
Yeah.
scientific perspective and a philosophical perspective.
Right.
My being wrong does not automatically make you right. There have to be two options. But of course, that was exactly what it was with creation science as well. Because creation science argued, well, here's all the problems with evolution. Evolution is a weak scientific theory. And because evolution doesn't work, then, God went poof. That was their argument.
Absolutely.
So,
you're right.
Again, so the science stinks, but and we could even handle their sort of second tier argument, which was that evolution is anti-religious, because we had all these people who were, I got more theologians behind me than they had behind them. We had plenty of theologians who could tell you right from the get-go that special creation, Genesis literalism, creation science was terrible theology. And there's another big, thick bench where we'll tell you why intelligent design is terrible theology, even going beyond William Paley. There's all sorts of problems with that. But you get to fairness, you get to these cultural values. This is where they really thrive. This is where they come into their own. But we evolutionists, people on my side of this controversy, evolutionists are sort of in the catbird seat. Evolution is in the textbooks. Evolution is in the curricula. Evolution has been taught. Hasn't always been taught very well, right? Sometimes they do a crappy job, and sometimes it's not enough, but it's in there. So in a sense, we are automatically in a defensive position. They're coming after us. We're not attacking them. And a defensive posture isn't always the easiest posture.
No, for sure.
Especially when you're dealing with these values things, which I think is why your views are so very helpful and useful here. But one of the things that we would do when they would come and use that, well, it's only fair to teach both, or it's only fair to, it's good pedagogy. To give the students both perspectives, either creation science and evolution or intelligent design and evolution, and then let the children decide, let the students decide. That was, and that just sounds
very
so
democratic.
Wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
Very democratic, but also pedagogical. Let's have critical thinking. We like our children to be critical thinking. What we would say is that it is not fair to miseducate students. It is not fair to deliberately teach children things that aren't true. It is simply not true that there are gaps in the fossil record. It is simply not true that that we lack natural explanations for complicated structures. And and we could get a lot of mileage out of that, because people would stop and say, oh, yeah, I guess so. And another thing that we would argue in that same context is that it's not fair to have students spend time on issues that are not really being debated. So what I would say when I would get the, good pedagogy, critical thinking argument, we'll let the students, God, I had these teachers who would say, I have half the students do creationism and half the students do evolution. And I would say, you were really beating up on those poor evolution students. Because all the creation students have to go up and find some junky creationist argument and say, this is why evolution is not true. And then the poor evolution student, who doesn't know very much science, has to spend this enormous amount of time telling the class why the creationist student is wrong. I mean, it's just unfair. That's unfair. And so, you have to come back and show them that it's unfair. The argument that you made, from which, of course, is the heart and soul of the Expelled movie, is the fact that these intelligent design proponents have been so persecuted by academia. They're not given their chance to shine. And of course, we would come back and say to that science is really the most democratic way of finding out stuff that you can imagine, because anybody can come up with an idea that overthrows the status quo, but you can't just assert it.
Right. Right.
You have to show why you, dare I say, have a better mousetrap,
Yeah.
be he or not.
Yeah.
So
Well, I have. I don't want to interrupt you, but
I could.
I have a number of reactions to what you just said, kind of based on the experience in Ohio, which you might not be as familiar with as you are on the national level. So,
Oh, I was in Ohio.
okay, I understand. Yeah,
I
of course.
remember your evolution wars,
Right,
and
right,
your
right.
science standards fight.
Well, there was a
2004.
woman, faculty colleague in the biology department named Susan Fisher. I don't know if you ever
Yes.
met her. You did. You meet her.
Yes.
Okay. So as you
Lovely
know,
woman.
Susan is an ordained minister, right? And her colleague Steve Rissing, also who's also a tremendous resource for me. He's also a very devout Christian, right?
Yeah.
And Susan was just so impatient with this idea that, well, you can't believe in God and in evolution. That those two just can't go together, right? And this just made her so crazy, right? So she organized this speaker series where she brought in all kinds of people like Francisco Ayala and Edward Humes and all these people basically to kind of debunk this idea that you can only believe in one, you can't believe in both. And I think, so that kind of thing I think was kind of successful. And in the book, I talk about a study I did with Steve in his class where he kind of took on this whole idea of sort of methodological naturalism and so forth. And that's a whole nother like area that we can get into if you want. But people at the end of his class, and he never mentioned, intelligent design or anything, but he just taught them, okay, this is what a scientific explanation looks like. Okay, here's what a non-scientific explanation looks like, right? And there was some improvement. We were able to document that people at the end we're more skeptical of these sort of, fringy kind of pseudoscientific ideas, right? So, it can happen. It works, right? But you're right. I mean, the ID side had some advantages in that they just seemed like such a reasonable thing to do, right? Such a common sense thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also, I talked to a lot of people on the Ohio Board of Education. They were all Republican. They were all Christians, right? Devout Christians, right? And the board was pretty much split down the middle, right? So a lot of the anti-ID, I shouldn't say split down the middle. There actually were, it was actually a very vocal minority who was really behind the ID movement in Ohio. A lot of these school board members I talked to would not have considered themselves sort of born again Christians. And they were really suspicious of the motives of some of these pro-ID folks. They really thought, God, these people, they want to establish a theocracy, right? They want to get prayer in schools, all these things that really troubled them as educators. So again, and just another example that, being religious does not make you, sort of automatically anti-evolution and pro-ID. Right?
We always referred to that as diffusing the religion issue.
Mm-hmm.
There are many, many ways that we could do that.
Right.
The kinds of testimonials that you were talking about with Susan and other people is a very good way of doing it.
Yeah.
One lesson that I taught actually before I even got involved with NCSE when I was teaching at the University of Kentucky, as I came up with a little, because I had creationist students in my physical anthropology classes. With physical anthropology, you start with evolution on day one. It's all about evolution. And it's the worst kind of evolution because it's human evolution. Worst of all.
Right.
But I would, and here it is. I lost my train of thought.
So teaching about evolution in Kentucky and
so I had a little exercise that I would do before I started talking about evolution, where I would preface it, say, well, we're going to talk about evolution, and some people believe that evolution is incompatible with religion. But actually, if you look at Christianity, it's not a dichotomous, you're either a Christian or you accept evolution. It's a continuum.
Right.
And the creation evolution continuum was an interesting exercise that worked extremely well.
Yeah.
And I've given it, I gave it to my classes at Kentucky. I've given it to at science teacher conventions. I've given it to scientist conventions. I've given it to the Rotary. I mean, I've used it in settings all over the place, and it works really well. You start with the flat earthers. You say, well,
Yep.
the most severe anti-evolutionists are the flat earthers, and of course very few people accept flat earthers. They're all nodding, of course. It's not. And then next down the continuum are geocentrists, and very few people, oh yes, very few people accept that. And then you have the young earth creationists, and they go, yeah, we've heard of those people, it's kind of and then the old earth creationists. And it's when you get down to the old earthers that people start looking, we've heard of these guys. Oh yeah, maybe a day is 1,000 years or 10,000 or some enormous long period of time. Okay, then they start getting involved. And then you talk about theistic evolution, and all of a sudden they go, oh, there's an alternative.
Right.
And then, of course, I had to complete, I'm obviously going to complete the continuum. Then there's materialist evolution. And I would identify myself as being there.
Yeah.
Sure. Just because I wasn't trying to persuade anybody, so you should or should not keep your faith. I was completely neutral about that. But I also wanted to, the vast majority of the young people in my Kentucky classrooms were Christians, but there was a certain percentage of them who were, not religious, and I didn't want to have them feel left out. So there is this other,
Right.
And it was, it basically, I always refer to it as getting the fingers out of the ears. It was the sort of thing that they gave themselves permission to listen to me.
Right.
And once they listened to the evidence, well, and they were assuaged of their concerns that they had to choose, things went much better. But seizing onto values is the key to success.
Right.
And it's, you have to be, we on my side of the issue have to use the same values, but turn it so that our perspective is the one that we want them to take. You were absolutely right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I could talk to you all night, but
of course.
That would be selfish of me. So may we have the first question, please? Tanner Edis, hello, Tanner, asks, as a public political issue, is ID really all that alive anymore? Among my students, and he teaches at a public Midwestern university, a very good one, by the way, it hasn't been all that salient for over a decade now.
That could be one of my colleagues. I teach at a public Midwestern university. Maybe we know each other. I don't know. This is one of those questions I'm sure you could answer a lot better than I could. I think that phrase, intelligent design, is really kind of dead. I think, I talked about there's a bill in the Arkansas House, I believe, an equal time bill. And I think they say creationism in that bill. They don't say intelligent design, right? So, and what we also see a lot is these, kind of critical evaluation of Darwinism kind of bills. And they're often paired with, sort of critical evaluation of climate science bills, So I think that's where,
like that Ohio HB1 that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Both sides are controversial issues.
Exactly. Right. So, so I think that's kind of where it's going, because again, I think this movement sort of writ large has learned from their mistakes, and they've learned what works, and what they've learned works is this kind of idea of, well, let's hear all sides, right? And it's kind of hard to not make connections to the sort of current political climate. In Ohio, there's a very powerful suspicion, even though Ohio State University can do no wrong. Basically, they are the kings of the academic world in Ohio. Nevertheless, right, we go in for a lot of suspicion in state government because we're seen as a bastion of liberal orthodoxy, right? That we indoctrinate students into a left-wing kind of ideology. Of course, we don't, but anyway. And so the catchword these days is viewpoint diversity, right? That we can't discriminate against people because of their ideology. I never discriminate against people because of their ideology. I discriminate against people who have the wrong ideas, right? And they could be coming from left, right, or center.
Who can't support their ideas.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So, when I teach my political science class, I come right out and I say, Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election, guys. Okay. You can love Donald Trump. You can hate Donald Trump. The fact is he lost that election fair and square. Right. I don't see that as viewpoint discrimination to simply present the facts. Right. I will not tell people, if you're pro-life, you're wrong, or if you're pro-choice, you're wrong, right? Right? Those are opinions, right? And
It's not
opinions
your-
are subjective. They're personal, right? They can't be right or wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
But, you know, as I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts, right? So,
Yep.
you know, if somebody,
I mean, when you talked about HB1 in Ohio, it was chilling. The fact that they're going after universities, but
yes,
that is another whole field of study of the attack
Yep.
by political conservatives against the universities.
Right, exactly.
It is very sad.
Yeah.
But there's one more. Sorry, just Andy Fracknoy. All right.
Oh, I missed it. Sorry.
Andy Fracknoy says, if this case came to the Supreme Court today, would they make the same decision?
That's a
as
great
Judge
question.
Jones?
Yeah, no, that's a great. I mean, there's clearly a connection between support for these kind of, you know, let's call them sort of creationist writ large and political conservatism. No doubt about it, right? Okay, and of course, the Supreme Court now is taken a rightward tilt. There's been an appointment of political conservatives to the bench, and that decision I talked about, Edwards versus Aguilar, you know this very well. The two dissenting voices were William Rehnquist and who's the other one? Scalia, yeah. So two, you know, very conservative justices, right? Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's a really good question. I mean,
I think I might be able to shed a little light on this for.
Yeah.
I don't think we should go before any court with any sort of creation and evolution case for the next 20 years. The reason is 1922.
Yep.
1922, the Supreme Court heard a case from a praying football coach in Washington State, Kennedy versus Bremerton. Now, you mentioned Edwards, and in Edwards, Rehnquist and Scalia dissented, and the reason why they dissented is because they just hated the precedent that the rest of the court was using to strike down the equal time law in Louisiana, and that precedent was Lemon versus Kurtzman.
Oh, sure.
Which was a way of evaluating whether a policy or law violated the First Amendment. And it was very clear there are three tests. Does it have a religious purpose? Does it have a religious effect? Does it cause entanglement with the government and religion? It's very straightforward. But there have been a number of conservative jurists who have hated Lemon from the get-go.
Yeah.
They finally got a test case. They finally struck down Lemon. So if you look at creation science and creationism, creation evolution jurisprudence, every single case since 1971 has been decided on the basis of Lemon. And now it's gone.
Yeah.
It is to be replaced with history and tradition.
Right.
Whatever that means.
Right.
So when I say we shouldn't go to court if we can help it, solve these things, get them, have them die, have these laws die in committee. Don't go to court for 20 years because the courts have not figured out what to do with Establishment Clause jurisprudence. Until that happens.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know this, but of course, one of the things that Andrew asked about whether if Kitzmiller were held today, the particular facts of Kitzmiller were just so good and so much on our side. In addition to having all the science, we also had school board members who lied under oath.
Yeah, sure.
So that was colorful. But on the other hand, Kitzmiller was decided on the basis of Lemon versus Kurtzman. And, Lemon is no more. Right. So if someone were to come up and say, well, we think intelligent design should be taught. We were able to strike it down. Our side was able to persuade the judge to strike it down because there was no pedagogical reason for teaching it. The only reason for teaching it was to promote religion. Right. Well, promoting religion is no longer a for striking something down by the Establishment Clause. So who knows?
Yeah.
And with that, I'm always such a cheerful person to have.
Well, I was going to just argue in answer to Andrew's question that, Judge Jones was a Republican judge. He was appointed by, I think, George W. Bush, right?
Practicing Lutheran.
Yeah. So, and there are some notable conservatives who come out very strongly against creationism, like Rush Limbaugh. He's not somebody I have a lot of respect for, but he was very clear that he came out against, he came out very much in favor of the Dover decision, and he said,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the Dover decision per se, but he thought, the whole issue was just nonsense. He agreed with the scientists that, this was a bogus theory, had no place, again. Yeah. So
stopped clock right twice a day.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. So even though, again, there's this obvious connection with conservative politics, but not every conservative, just like not every devout Christian, is somebody who's on board with creationist ideas.
And, one of the reasons why groups like the Seventh-day Adventists are so strong for the separation between religion and government is because if you allow the government to take a position on religion, it might be your religion sometime in the future that gets disfavored. And so, minority religions have been very, very firm on no, government should keep its nose out of religion, and vice versa. Religion should not be telling the government what to do either.
Right. Well, and I think, as I mentioned, a lot of these school board members I talked to in Ohio, were these devout Christians. And that was kind of their concern. We don't want somebody from another denomination, even though we're all Christians, right, to be kind of enforcing their particular, traditions on the rest of us, right?
Well, when I was, especially in the 80s and 90s, when I was dealing with creation science and whether, that could be taught, we always would find clergy to testify at school board meetings, because again, it's giving people permission to vote against the bill. Because if you have Minister A saying you can't teach this, Minister B saying, yes, you should teach this because it's my religious views. The fact that there is men of the cloth, people of the cloth, saying, no, we don't want it. We want to teach it our way. That allows the decision makers to make a decision on the merits.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really smart, politically, because, a lot of people, ask, what do we have to do about this kind of anti-science activity? And for some people, the answer is always education, right? People need to understand, evolution better. They need to understand the climate science better. In the social sciences, we refer to this as the information deficit model, or the knowledge deficit model.
More science.
Yeah, more science. And of course, yes, absolutely. If people understood evolution, of course, they would be able to recognize. But I don't know if we should hang our hat on that, right? And so these efforts, to kind of explore ways of making evolution seem not threatening, that don't necessarily rely on everybody, sort of boning up on evolutionary theory, right? I think are really valuable, really important. Yeah.
No, it's knowledge of science, knowledge of evolution or climate change or vaccinations or anything else. Content knowledge and knowledge of science as a way of knowing is necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah.
We really need to look at why people are objecting so much.
Right.
And it's not because they are worried about the medieval warm period.
Right.
It's because they believe that there's something about climate science that affects their deeply held values and beliefs.
Yes.
Can we have another question, please? Jay asks, the battle to teach religious-based origin stories continues. What's next for this movement? Will it rise again in a new form as it did with ID? You kind of had answered this, I think, with the
I think
evidence against evolution, etc.
I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse of this to a much greater extent than I have. But to me, it really does seem like this kind of critical analysis idea is the one that's kind of the new manifestation, right? Even if you don't propose a specific alternative theory, just kind of raising these specious kind of arguments about, the alleged weaknesses in evolutionary theory, that's bad enough, I think, So that is kind of what I worry, and I worry in a broader sense about, anti-science attitudes, and this is the political scientist in me coming out, but this idea that we can't trust the experts anymore, right? And we is really troubling to me. I think it's very important. I mean, your society is the Bay Area skeptics. It's important to be skeptical. It's important to raise questions. It's important to examine the evidence and examine the proof, but to just kind of have this sort of working narrative that these people, these so-called experts, are not to be trusted. They've got an agenda, So I find that really troubling. And in political science, we call this populism, right? This idea, this sort of anti-expert, kind of anti-elite mindset. And it's kind of come and gone in the history of American politics, but I see it's really coming back pretty strong.
Yeah, and it's disturbing, but maybe that's another whole talk for. Well, Tom, before I tell people about next month's talk, let me just thank you profusely and profoundly.
Well, I think, I mean, I think I'm the one who owes you thanks. I was really glad to have the opportunity to do this. As I said, I think this is payback for all the help that you've given me, and I could talk about this stuff all day. So and anytime you want to chat.
All right, let's stay in touch. Thank you, Tom.
Very good. Thank you so much.
I know. But all you stay here because I need to tell you about a couple of very important things. First of all, mark your calendars for August 23rd because Skeptical is coming back. And although we've spent since 2020 and COVID, we've got produced Skeptical online. This year, 2025, on August 23rd, we're going to have it in person. And I know many people are very delighted to hear that. It's going to be held at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center, OACC, in downtown Oakland, very close to BART. It'd be very easy for everybody to get there. Many of you will, watching this, have probably attended the OACC Skeptical location previously, and it's got this great auditorium. It's a really great place to meet. In June, next month, our speaker will be Dr. Nicholas Matsky. Now, you're going to kind of wonder why intelligent design is 2 months in a row, but it just happened to be that way. Nick Matsky was NCSE's staff member who is most responsible for teaching science to the lawyers in Kitzmiller versus Dover 20 years ago this year. The title of Nick's talk is The Science Class You Wish You Had Taken, which is a line actually from one of the many reporters who covered the Kitzmiller trial. He will ask, what have we learned about evolution and anti-evolutionism that we didn't know 20 years ago? So if Scopes was the monkey trial, Kitzmiller was the flagellum trial. What have we learned about evolution as opposed to intelligent design of the bacterial flagellum, as one example? I think you'll find this a very enjoyable talk. Nick will also talk about some evolutionary relationships of the intelligent design movement as well, and where they have gone subsequent to 2005's Kitzmiller versus Dover. So I think you're going to find this a very enjoyable talk. So join us on the second Thursday of June, June 12th at 7:30 Pacific here on YouTube. And I will see you then. And thank you very much for joining Bay Area Skeptics tonight. Good night.